Thanks very much. Good morning. First of all, I'd like to stress that I'm not an expert in this field, but I've been asked to give this paper on behalf of Professor Ahmed Bakr due to my status as a native English speaker. So I hope I can do him justice. The paper is called Psychosocial Political Perception of Identity Among Palestinian Youth. Although the topic of identity development in children receives extensive attention by psychologists, it remains fertile ground for social scientists who wish to liberate themselves from traditional theories of child psychosocial development. There is ample conceptual, constructual, theoretical and empirical evidence available to psychologists to predict the global course of development in children. Sociologists, political scientists and other social scientists have also delineated many of the variables and factors that influence the course of change which takes place naturally within societies. This plethora of scientific evidence, however, was accumulated mainly by Westerners and about Western societies. The relatively sparse, available and accumulated knowledge on Asian, African and Latin American societies, unfortunately, also was either conducted by Western researchers or interpreted within the context of Western theories and constructs. Native researchers in the developing countries are cognizant of the fact that a substantial amount of the information, data and artifacts collected on their societies and cultures is held in trust in the archives and databanks of the developed nations. In essence, I argue that developed nations are far superior to the developing nations, not only economically, militarily and technologically, but far more ominously in their knowledge of the developing nations. We, the developing nations, are studied, examined and analysed by the other developed nations more than we study, examine and analyse ourselves. Any analysis on the development of identity within transitional societies we present today is to some extent hostage to this epistemological bondage. Furthermore, the expansive nature of the topic dictates that we delineate the limits of our argument prior to delving into our presentation. First of all, I would like to make it clear that it is not my intention to present, argue, or expound on the natural development of identity in youth. Any deserving textbook on psychosocial and child development can outperform my effort. Nor do I intend to focus on the nature of individual identity development in youth. The purpose of my presentation will to be examine analytically the course of collective national identity in transitional societies. More specifically, I will focus on the manner in which the collective identity of a society develops within the context of the conflict it finds itself embroiled in, between the image it draws for itself and the image the other wishes to impose on it. In other words, the first gist of my argument will be that development of identity in transitional societies, or developing societies, is inherently one of conflict. Second, it is not the intention of this presentation to focus on societies undergoing natural social change. Instead, my thrust will be on societies that are undergoing a transition from being politically liberated from colonialism or occupation to being liberated from cultural hegemony. The struggle of liberation in these societies, I argue, has a profound effect on how the collective identity develops. Finally, being most familiar with the society, the Palestinian society, which is in the midst of the clutches of this transitional process, I will utilise this experience to shed light on the arguments I propose for illustrative purposes only. Although the term identity is the object of our discourse and analysis in this session, I am uncertain how alien this term is to non-Western societies, especially those in Asia and Africa. The modern Arabic term for identity, hawiyya, seems to be a recent phenomenon. Abdul Latif al-Barghouti, in 1995, for example, could not find the term mentioned in Arabic lexicons prior to the mid-19th century. He cites Bustani, showing that the term has both philosophic and linguistic roots. Linguistically, it's derived from the singular pronoun huwa, he, denoting the absolute truth that unfolds all truths of the unknown, just as a kernel unfolds its own potential tree. Furthermore, the term could also be derived from the union with the self, i.e. complete personal identity. Hence, the term identity in Arabic juxtaposes, derives, and unites the individual with the collective. The diffusion between the individual and the collective also appears to be true in African societies. For example, there are no comparable terms for uncle, aunt, or niece in the Xhosa language. No linguistic differentiation is made between father and uncle, mother and aunt, daughter and niece. Personal identity is derived from the collective one. The former unfolds only within the realm of the latter. Hence, personal identity is also derived from the historic development of collective identity. Palestinian identity, as an example, is a product of Arab, Muslim, Christian, and national legacies. Its origin, as is the case in many African and Asian societies, is tribal. Consequently, one cannot address a people's collective identity divorced from its legacy and culture. Heritage provides the ligature which maintains the integrity of identity. The destruction of a people's culture is tantamount to the destruction of its identity. And then I go on to talk about identity development within an occupation relationship. Fanon in 1965 elucidated the relationship between the colonized or occupied and the colonizer, occupier, as one of continued conflict. The colonizer or occupier does not relinquish his dream of subjugating the native, who in turn refuses to relinquish his aspiration of gaining independence from his colonizer or occupier. Physical subjugation, the occupier learns, however, cannot be maintained indefinitely and without great cost. Unfortunately, his dream of subjugating the native does not extinguish itself as he relinquishes his physical control over him. His aspiration finds its expression in the colonization of the native's culture, and ultimately the colonization of his mind and identity. The native, on the other hand, tries desperately to rediscover his identity by navigating the pages of his history and culture. The occupier, aware of this need, craftily tries to provide him with a map whose landmarks were not etched by the native's ancestors. The quest for the indigenous landmarks becomes of crucial importance. The emerging collective identity of this nation in transition thus becomes contingent on the landmarks it assimilates. It is within this context I postulate that the development of identity within occupied societies is inherently one of conflict. The image the colonizer or occupier desires for the native to formulate for himself, i.e. identity, is essentially that of the colonizer-occupier, but packaged in native clothing. It is this identity which Steve Biko referred to as whites walking in black skin. This process can be achieved only through colonization of the mind, culture, and historical legacy. Identity thus becomes the battleground between national assertion on the one hand and domination and subjugation by the occupying power on the other hand. Children and youth develop their identity in a series of ever-increasing, decreasing, and expanding, contracting, concentric cultural circles. The number of circles dictates only the extent to which identity becomes constricted or global. True identity, however, is defined by the cultural images the child or youth assimilates. One process is quantitative, the other qualitative. Although I will touch upon the quantitative aspect of this process, my main thrust will be on its qualitative aspects. It is this aspect of identity development which becomes the target of occupational manipulation versus national will. The term identity, as we have seen, may be a relatively nascent phenomenon in developing countries. Its coining in the mid-19th century in the Arab world, however, may not have been a capricious event. The advent of the modern collective Arab identity is highly correlated with the advent of Arab nationalism during that period. Prior to that, the concentric circles encompassing Arab identity were limited to the religious, primarily Muslim, and the tribal. Palestinian identity became crystallized and strengthened in direct proportion to the strength of the Palestinian nationalism. The collective identity of those inhabiting Palestine prior to World War I was primarily Muslim, Arab, tribal. Arab identity superseded Palestinian collective identity Only prior to the disintegration of Palestine in 1948 and the rise of the Palestinian national resistance movement in the early 1960s. Recent studies conducted by myself and other psychologists show that Palestinian national identities are a direct function of the contiguity between the Palestinian national resistance movement and the population it influences directly. For example, Mahjoub and his colleagues in 1989 found that Palestinian youth living in Palestine, the West Bank and Gaza Strip, and Syria and Lebanon identify themselves as Palestinian in word and social representation. When requested to respond to the stimulus, I am, most of the respondents identified themselves as Palestinian, Palestinian Arab, or Arab Palestinian. Few perceived their identity to be only Arab or Muslim. Furthermore, when the subjects were asked to complete drawings using crayons of variant colours, brown, white, black, red, green, yellow, and blue, they invariably chose Palestinian colours, red, green, black, and white, more than the other colours. The themes they also drew were Palestinian in essence. The most prominent themes emanating from the drawings were Palestinian in essence, for example, Palestinian flags, scenes of resistance, etc. On the other hand, my research on Palestinian youth born and living in Israel does not support the assumption that they identify themselves primarily as Palestinian in word or social representation. While Palestinian children and youth living in Israeli-occupied Palestine and Palestinian refugee camps in Syria and Lebanon identified themselves as Palestinian, Palestinian children and youth living in Israel identified themselves as Israeli Arabs or Arabs of the inside. Furthermore, while the national colours of Palestine, red, green, black, and white, dominated the drawings of the former group, the national colours of Israel, blue and white, dominated the drawings of the latter group. Hence, we can detect the battle here between the assertion and repression of national identity. Although Arabs living in Israel are ethnically Palestinian, Israel adamantly resists and combats such a development by fragmenting the collective national identity of Palestinians living in Israel into sub-collective identities, such as Muslims, Christians, Druze, and Bedouins, encapsulated within a larger and incongruent structure called Israeli Arabs. In essence, Israeli policy reverts the collective identity of the Palestinians under its rule to mid-19th century levels. The collective identity of Palestinians in Israel, Mary found, also was closely correlated with the rise of Palestinian and Arab nationalism. He shows that the identity of Palestinians who came under Israeli rule in 1948 shifted from being primarily Arab-Israeli between 1948 to 1973 to primarily Arab and Arab-Palestinian between 1973 and 1986. It is interesting to note here that this shift came following the 1973 October War between Israel on the one hand and Egypt and Syria on the other, but did not take place following the 1967 Arab-Israeli War. This finding is quite understandable given that Arabs in general and Palestinian Arabs living in Israel in particular found it psychologically difficult to identify with the performance of the Arab armies in 1967 in comparison with their admirable performance in the 1973 October War. In conclusion, Dr. Bakri would suggest that irrespective of the method or practice used, the ultimate goal of occupation is either to deny, reject, or obliterate the natives' indigenous heritage and culture. Depriving children and youth from their cultural heritage leads to their psychological untethering from their native culture and anchored to the culture of their oppressor. In other words, the identity model which the youth begins to adopt is not her native one. Leeser in 1991 has defined such a practice as a form of genocide. He states, one of the most insidious forms of genocide consists of the destruction of a people's culture by depriving it of its work of art, its literature, its language, or the land to which it is rooted, by tearing children away from their parents and communities, compelling them to be raised in a foreign environment where they will be deprived of their own culture and required to assimilate to that of their captors. Thank you.